Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nishant. Thanks for the introduction, David. I run strategy and technology at Nokia. I'll talk about not so much regarding the aspect of business in the next year or so, but I'll talk about the way we do this is we'll look at the market long term, and we build a long-term horizon thinking. We bring it back to midterm and see how the portfolio should evolve, and then how the short-term resource allocation should be. So I'll try and connect that over the next 10 slides or so. I am just a brief introduction as to how long I've been. I've been with the company now 18 months. I joined January of last year. Prior to that, I was with an auto tech company, and prior to that with Ericsson running the mobile business. This is how my unit is structured. And there is a reason why I put up this slide, and that is because prior organization at Nokia, several of these functions were quite dispersed and isolated. What we have tried to do is to find a proper way of building our group strategy, which is driven by a technology vision. And that drives what the corporate strategy should be. That's how we then orient the research in the Bell Labs units. And a big part of my unit then is focused on industry standardization, working very closely with Yanni, 3GPP, IETF, ITU, IEEE. Industry standards leading into 3 or 4 different aspects. Into products, that's when a lot of the Bell Labs technologies are then transferred into the BGs, that's on the top left. Some go into incubation and venturing. We've launched our internal incubator, and our internal venture capital has always existed. That's with NGP. I also have the ecosystems and strategy for partnerships. This is a very different world now, so we can't do everything ourselves. And then finally, digitalization and security. So we see this as a circle. It was quite disconnected earlier. The businesses who were building products weren't really thinking about what the 25 and beyond would be. So we've tried to put some sense to it. And I'll lead you through what we have done internally. So this is a lot of what we discuss in the group management team. I'll start with how we build our technology vision, a couple of slides on that. So we started looking at 2030 and building things backwards from there. A few trends. Let's start with actually the user needs. We started looking at, today we serve the CSP who serves the consumer. We buy a smartphone, and that's how the business goes. Then we started to say, is that the only user that will exist in 2030? And the answer is absolutely no. We actually then looked at 4 different kind of consumer sets, user sets. Industry, OT, enterprise IT, consumer, and then not to be forgotten, the developer. And I'll delve into that a little bit more, because we've all heard about this concept called programmable networks, and that's where the developer comes in. From a user perspective, everything as a service, digital first, procurement or provisioning of the service digitally. The experience is not limited to a smartphone. The experience can be much beyond a smartphone, and I'll talk about that in a second. When I say new purchasing priorities, of course, the price is still very, very important. Everybody worries about the cost of the service that they're procuring, but there are other aspects that start to come into play when you evolve your user set to beyond the consumer. For example, in an industrial setting, an enterprise CIO is not looking only at the download throughput. They're looking at an outcome. Does it serve the purpose of that enterprise CIO for that campus? So it's a different user set. We looked at some socioeconomic and geopolitical trends. Deglobalization is an absolute truth today. It's increasing. It impacts supply chains. It impacts standardization. And that's something we keep a very close eye on. We don't want the standards to fragment, for example. That's not good for the business in the industry as such. The other 2 on the bottom, cybersecurity and sustainability. Cybersecurity is now, let's just say, it's an unnecessary evil that's here to stay. We all have to work with it. It's very much related to the geopolitical situation regarding deglobalization. Uh, I run the security for the group, and we've seen a very distinct behavior on our cyber defense center post the war in Europe. So this is something we just have to keep an eye on. It's a huge market as well, by the way. It's nearly 400 billion by the end of this decade. So that's another trend that we keep an eye out. And sustainability here is related to largely ecological power profiling of our products. I used to look at this industry about 5 years back, and I say, if I have the right product and the right cost with the performance and the earlier time to market, I'll sell a lot. That's not sufficient anymore. The product has to have the right power profile and has to be secure. Those two additional metrics have come into play. And finally, on the trends, there is the state-driven innovation. This is again related to geopolitical. A lot of the countries are now launching their own funds, which are now impacting how this industry works. So these trends on the left and right, and then the most important ones that we see in the middle. Of course, everybody's here heard the word metaverse. So it's important I talk about it as well, I guess. But let's start with something that is already quite successful today and quite pervasive. That's the cloud. If you go back again 4 or 5 years, there used to be a telco world and a cloud world. There is no distinction anymore. Cloud is an absolute part of telecommunications networks. I have put Web3 there as well. This is to be seen. We are monitoring this. Today, the internet is very much built based on principles of Web 2.0. We'll see how the tokenization and decentralization of the internet evolves. It's something to be watched. It's not necessary for the metaverse to have Web3, but the metaverse benefits from the tokenization in certain cases. And I'll talk about metaverse in the next slide, so I'm not delving into it. But when we kept these trends in mind, 2030, then we started building, saying, what will the traffic in the networks be? First and foremost, this concept called metaverse, it's very sexy, this word, but it's really built on 2 enablers. The first enabler, that's on the right here, digital physical fusion, in very simple words, is digital twinning. To build a digital twin of a physical object. And I'll give you guys an example. That creates a lot of traffic on the network. And then if you augment a user into that digital twin, that's how you interact with the metaverse. And that creates a lot of uplink traffic, for example. And then we looked at the progression. By the way, this whole term metaverse, I have some colleagues in the back who are from Bell Labs. We've been talking about human augmentation. We've been talking about digital twinning in Bell Labs for a long time now. We just didn't come up with the word metaverse, but that's how we look at it. Today, from a digital physical fusion perspective, there are digital twins. I mean, if you just YouTube digital twin, you'll find a digital twin of a refinery, a mine, a bridge, a factory. I mean, there are several digital twins that exist today already. And from a human augmentation, I'm sure we've heard about head-mounted displays, VR glasses, etc. Very early stage. So I would say relatively mature on digital twinning already in the world today, quite early as to how the technology evolves in this case. But then we looked at 2030. And in 2030, these digital twins become far more complex. We look at digital twins of cities, for example, for smart traffic monitoring. We're looking at interoperability between different ecosystems in the digital twins. And they are then augmented, in this case, by, in some cases, industrial exoskeletons. They're augmented in some cases with mixed reality or XR interoperability. This results, in our opinion, not 1, but 3 metaverses, or 3 kinds or 3 categories of metaverses. The first one everyone's heard of, the consumer metaverse. This is around social entertainment. This is around gaming. This is how this industry is progressing. Uh, the consumer metaverse is very much related to, let's call it, wireless opportunities in the industry. Whether it's tethered at home to your home Wi-Fi or mobile outside, that's how the consumer metaverse is built on a wide area network in that sense. The enterprise metaverse, which is IT-centric, this is for collaboration, communication, enterprise training. This is built on a fixed network to an enterprise premises. Then the final one, the industrial metaverse, which is more OT-centric. This is built not on a wide area network, not on a fixed network, but in our opinion, this is built on a subnet that the industry now famously calls private networks. This is built on a premise that you will need to use, consume, produce data on a premise. There's an enterprise edge, and then there's a private network that the enterprise owns. I am not making the distinction here whether it is licensed, whether it's unlicensed, could be either. I'm not making the distinction whether it's 3GPP or IEEE, could be either, depending on the application. But I have to say, when the world talks about metaverse, we tend to deviate towards the top right excessively. And in our humble opinion, the real metaverse that has already begun to exist is on the bottom right. And this goes back to my comment, there's so many digital twins that already exist. A lot of industries, physical industries, have started to use exoskeletons combined with digital twins. The cost of insurance for back injuries in the US is more than $100 billion. Exoskeletons with digital twins helps you solve some of that problem already today. So the maturity of industrial metaverse already there today, and we believe that's the first metaverse that will actually happen. And it goes in that order. The consumer metaverse is far from us. The price points, the capability of those VR devices is far from optimal. So the way we started looking at how does this impact us? Well, the industrial metaverse is bound to happen first. That's our belief. So what should we do about that? That means there will be a huge market for private networks that we need to address. The enterprise metaverse, which happens next, does that mean that 25 gig PON goes to 50 gig PON or 100 gig PON? How does the traffic profile impact what we do on fixed passive optical networks? That's something that we have to think about. And I'll bring it back together to that point in a second. And then consumer metaverse is really, in my humble opinion, this is not 5G. This is 5G advanced to 6G. And I'll show you that. I mean, you can pull off a very good experience, mobile consumer VR experience with what we have today. So then we started looking at the three markets. I'll start with consumer because it's, let's say, the most understood. And that's why, by the way, we tried to overlay these graphs. In these markets, the market sizing is from industry analysts. I will show you from who in a second. But we started looking at traffic that this would create. And we thought about overlaying this graph with traffic, the market size with traffic in the networks. We didn't have to because they were identical. The market comes when the traffic comes, and the traffic comes when the market comes. We extrapolated the single largest user of the network today, that's smartphone video, and we said if there's 8K video, 3 hours a day, everybody using a smartphone is consuming video all the time, or 3 hours, that's massive on 8K. The traffic saturates in 27. And that's where we see that by 2028, the usage of the network is dominated with consumer mixed reality. versus smartphone 8K video. That changes how we build these networks. Then we looked at enterprise. Again, this goes back to fixed networks. 9x. So we did several scenarios. We did a conservative one, we did an aggressive one, but we settled somewhere between 8 and 10x higher bandwidth consumption. Does that mean that on an average today in a Western economy, you're having a gigabit to home with GPON? A lot of those are being upgraded to 10 gig, many cases 20 gig. Verizon's rolling out 40 gig in some cases. But this means that you would need far more. If I ask this question to my colleagues at Bell Labs, they would say, you're going to break the Shannon limit if you get there. We can't. That's the law of physics. That means a lot more fiber needs to be deployed to these enterprises to just serve the need of the enterprise metaverse. And by the way, this got accentuated by the pandemic. Pre-pandemic and post-pandemic is very different already. Finally, the industrial metaverse, which I've said is probably the most mature, and that's what you see in the graph as well. We already see a market for the industrial metaverse. We see a market for industrial devices already, for industrial applications. We announced yesterday on our private network, the way we approach this market, we sell a private network. We've deployed about 1,200 of those. I don't know what the latest count today is because we're adding many per week. We announced yesterday that with the private wireless, we actually announced already some months ago that we will deliver an edge node. We called it a mixed edge node for edge workloads for the enterprise. That has been a huge success for us in the market. And yesterday we opened the ecosystem for that enterprise edge node that we deliver as part of our private network. And we are onboarding third-party applications. The first applications that we have onboarded are the mediation software from Siemens for digital twinning. What we have already onboarded on that enterprise edge device that ships with our private network is the PTL digital twinning software, because we already see a market. That market exists. We've had a fantastic feedback from the analyst community already that you are approaching this the right way. So we're looking at gaining from the opportunity from the right, preparing for the opportunity in the middle, and then standardizing for the opportunity in the left. I will talk about, I wanted to put these timelines for perspective. Really anything that's wireless needs 5G advanced, and then the hockey curve will require 6G. I will talk about the value chains. Sorry, you were about to take a picture. I will talk about how we see the value chain, because it's not just, okay, we understand that there will be traffic on the networks, woohoo. Because traffic has been going up on these networks for as long as I've been in the business. The question is, what are we going to do about that? How are we gain as Nokia? What are we going to do with our portfolio as a consequence? So then, the first difference that you see, if somebody were to put this slide up, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, we would have thought about service provider. That's a very limited view of the world today. We look at these 4. The way we looked at 4 sets of users, we're looking at now 4 different distinct set of customers. And CSP is just one of them. And their requirements are very different. If you sell to a CSP, they will need a small cell, they will need a macro cell. If you sell to a CSP, they will need a cell site router, they will need an edge router, they will need an aggregation router, a core router. The flexibility and scalability requirements are very different. What these guys are focused on is consumability. Can I get an outcome that I can do something with? When we now sell a private network to a mine, they're not worried about what's the throughput. They're worried about the use cases. They're worried about consuming this for an outcome. Then if you sell to the government, of course, there's no surprise here. They are worried about getting the first product they can get their hands on, the latest 3GPP release. They're worried about, they're not so worried about this. They don't care if it's 3GPP release 15 versus release 17, as long as the outcome is met. So the customer set is different. When we start looking at the metaverse in 2030, it's important, it's almost critical that we look at that industry being served not just by the CSPs. And that's how we have approached our business strategy. That's how we have approached our product strategy, which I will conclude with. By the way, if you look at these customers, then they lead to a different requirement on the network as well. New services are needed. So I'll give you guys a very simple example. Almost all of us will have one or two devices in this room. If you were to make a 911 call on that device, the PSAP, the public safety access point nearest to us, would locate that you are in the NYSC building. They will say, with a few square meters accuracy, the 911 call would go through and say, this is where the device called from. That's the level of accuracy that you have with the consumer wide area access network. Imagine if you were to take that level of accuracy in terms of localization into a factory and you had drones communicating with each other, there will be crashes all the time. The localization that that private network needs is centimeter level in a 3 dimension. So instead of knowing that Paul is in this room, we have to know that the drone is here. That's the change in the network profile that we have to get to. I also like this example around latency. If you have a healthcare application and you have a latency issue, you have a problem there. Same with reliability. The one time that call need to go through, it didn't because it was only 5 nines. That's a disaster in many mission critical applications. So the service needs, everybody in the consumer world, when you go to a store, whether it's Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, US Cellular, you're looking at what throughput would I get, and there's this application, and I'm not going to promote them, but you can say, hey, I'm getting that throughput, that's good, my 5G works. That's just one dimension of the service needs. And that's the promise of monetization of these networks. Then that requires, like I said, okay, good, we have had a vision, we looked at trends, we made the metaverse as part of our vision based on human augmentation and digital twinning. Then we brought it back to the 3 industries, the 3 customer sets that we're going to serve, government being the 4th one. Finally, we said, what do we need to build then? We need to build to actually serve this. We need to put our money where our vision is. So we can't just keep building unidimensionally for performance. There is several aspects. A lot of them are already quite well covered with 5G or with fixed passive optical networks, but not sufficiently. That's where the role of standardization comes, and that's where we think the world will absolutely need 6G as well. And I will translate this in the next 3 slides to actual metaverse requirements. So if you look at, we take 3 examples, starting with the consumer metaverse. We take immersive gaming as an example. Here for immersive gaming, you don't need all of those aspects of the network. You need ubiquity. You need very high performance and resilience. In some cases, when you're using haptic devices, unique sensing as well, and so on and so forth. So these aspects of the network are important. So what's Nokia going to do about that? Well, we are already entrenched in the bottom right. We're selling premium connectivity in this case. That's our job. That's our base business. With a lot of these consumer metaverse will need excessive deployment of the edge. And I talked about how we're shipping a lot of enterprise edge, but that's not the multi-purpose edge cloud I'm talking about here. This is very much still, when I say multi-purpose edge cloud, this is regional cloud by a cloud provider, and that's where we see a market for us. In this case, we're looking at the market for tier 0, tier 1, tier N switching into an edge data center. That's the additional market that comes with the consumer metaverse. And then we want to complement that with what we call as network as a code for API extraction for programmable networks that we want to sell to CSPs for them to be able to monetize these networks. Because if they're simply selling subscriptions in 2030, this industry will have a problem. They will have to sell APIs together with subscriptions. That's the consumer metaverse. That's the opportunity behind it. Then we looked at the enterprise metaverse. Gets a little bit more exciting. The top line comes into play. We don't always then have to go through a CSP to equip an enterprise with a private network. The CSP comes in play if it's licensed. If it's unlicensed, we don't. That's a completely new market for us. And there we're selling solutions. And finally, if you look at an industrial network, the attributes of the network are completely different in this case. And there we are actually not selling networks anymore. We're selling platforms, we're selling outcomes. That's what the industry buys. And in some cases, we do go direct. In several cases, we actually now go through system integrators and partners. We've announced partnerships and system integration relationships as GTM for this part of our business. And this is just the start. If I go back to that curve, you guys might remember, this is just the start of the industrial metaverse. And we want our share with it, because the industrial metaverse does not exist without a bloody good network. And that market hasn't existed yet. So those three metaverses, three different value chains, need a completely different service requirement from the network and new network capabilities. And that's how then we build our tech strategy that drives our portfolio. So then we looked at all of that, and then we said, okay, this is our strategy from a technology perspective. What, and I will not go into that. That will be a long time if I start to go through that. What foundational investments would we need? I actually talked about those 4 foundational investments even at the Capital Market Day in March last year. Those are investments we are making. All of us have heard the story of Nokia falling behind on semiconductor. Not anymore. These foundational investments have been ongoing, but those are not sufficient based on what I talked about. We will need transformational investments as well. All of this is driven by not just systems, but software. This is a huge area of investment for us, whether it comes to software for applications or application enablers for private networks, whether it's software to move to 5G advanced layer 1. It's the single largest investment we have. That has to be complemented through AI. We have Thierry in the back of the room who has a full center of excellence of AI that we have instituted now. So that's a big area of investment for us. And I put consumability on the top because CSPs don't worry about consumability. Enterprises do. And we were not so good at it. We need to transform our offering to be consumable by developers, by system integrators. Otherwise, we will not be able to get the fulfillment of the market I just talked about. So those are the 3 new areas of investment. And what we have done, we have had now several alignment, call it in a big company, where we're now driving this across business groups, those investments, in research in my unit. And now we're making sure that every product group embraces this. And I just want to lay out a few examples. So for wireless, I talked about that being important for 2 of the metaverses, 5G Advanced, 6G. We announced Easy Mesh Wi-Fi, which is basically combining Wi-Fi and 3GPP networks. In the case of fixed, what we call as adaptive fabric, that serves the third kind of metaverse. We're talking 25 gig PON. In Bell Labs, we have already demonstrated 100 gig PON. We're also here working on 800 gig and beyond on the optical and on routing, coherent routing. And we try to bring this back from a governance perspective as well, because we don't want the product groups to lose sight of what they're building for. In terms of consumability, move as much software to as a service as possible. Move from licensing to subscription. Expose APIs where possible, make them consumable for developers. Our digital automation cloud is the underpinning of our private network offering. And finally, Jenny will talk about this a lot, our research and development in AV, our research and development in AR, VR devices that we collaboratively work between her unit and my unit. And this is built on the fundamental of research coming out of Bell Labs Core and Bell Labs Solution, which I have learned in my years in the industry, when you find something really good, you want to make sure that you lead the standards with it. Because you don't want something else to go in the standards, then I have to catch up on the product side. This is our tech strategy. This is how we drive long horizon thinking, midterm portfolio, and short-term resource allocation in the company.